To you, my reader. I'm not writing this for the usual reasons. This isn't a cry for help, nor is it another report of a mysterious happening that led to the death of those involved. I'm writing this to tell you all something that has been affecting me for well over the last decade. Something that only recently I've come to become suspicious of. You see, I'm one of those infuriating people that are, quite to their own enjoyment, naturally adept at the process of lucid dreaming. You know, that thing where you dream that you're awake? Yeah, I pretty much do that every night. I've always been able to just flick a switch, and suddenly whatever I want is happening. And I'm experiencing it just as I would in real life. Even when I was little, I used to slip soundly into my own little fantasy world, full of whatever had caught my eye the previous day. I would be, I don't know, a superhero fighting off helpless villains, or I would be a knight charging into a castle to save a helpless maiden. You name it, I've lived it. I was just sleeping at the time. So why on earth you're muttering to yourself at 3 in the morning on whatever night this is for you, would I have a complaint about being able to will into existence anything and everything I desire as soon as my head hits the pillows? Well, it all started with a thump. I was 10 and an energetic little boy. My father and I used to live in the middle of a forest so thick that it strangled the house. It was a nuisance to father, who had to regularly cut back trailing bramble and heavy sheets of hawthorn from the drive up to the house. But for a maniacally excitable lad like me, it was almost as much of a paradise as my sleeping mind was. Safe to say, from the ages of 4 upwards, I was basically feral. I would run through the undergrowth with speed and skill born from thousands of trips through the cutting thorns, which I barely even registered anymore, sporting a homemade bow and arrows, hunting imaginary bears and wolves. It was even better with more people. My friends and I would play team tag through the woods. It would usually end with me and my closest friends, Jack and Thomas, winning by default, either because someone had fallen and was crying, or we were up a tree and couldn't even be found, and never mind reached, to tag. It was at one of these excursions that it happened. See, there was this clearing about 300 meters into the forest. In it there were these remains of an old house, a great stone behemoth of a dwelling, which sat squat and run down amidst the dark forestry. I'd been there hundreds of times before, and the husk was now one of my favorite places. It had been gutted, of course, so all that remained were the old floors. These were now much to the wonder of my group when we found it, held up by a massive black-bark tree whose branches held the upper floors of the house up like great gnarled support beams. They were safe to walk on, and thus the house became our designated fort. We would furnish the place with all manner of stuff, chairs made from tree stumps we would dig up, larger rocks we would all lug up into the place. The tree itself was used in place of the stairs that had since collapsed. I would dream of the place, of how it looked when it was big, in its prime, or even had a roof. I would see the stately family sitting around the roaring fireplace, while snow gently brushed against the brass-latched windows. I loved that place, though what I loved most was the tree in the middle. It was almost pitch black and of no discernible species that my 5-year-old mind could comprehend. It was huge, though. It stretched up higher than any of the other trees around it, and if you were careful, and father was nowhere to be seen, then you could climb to the topmost branches and look out over the rolling countryside and undulating hills in the distance. Where I spent the majority of the time, however, was one of the topmost rooms of the house itself, where the tree had grown incredibly curiously. The tree grew up the very middle of the house, its great branches holding up the other floors through sheer consequence of where they had grown thick and strong enough to act as support. But where the tree reached this almost attic room, it did something strange. It cradled it, almost in a perfect basket of branches. Great bows and strangling trunks coiled around the room and up the walls, holding it almost exactly where it had obviously been before it had fallen into disrepair. I would sit on the windowsill of that room and look out, watching the other children running around, and feel like a king lording over his subjects. The window was still in place, so I would open it and shout orders to the other kids, who would run to and from our pile of unwanted building material that we'd poached off the nearby housing development, going about building whatever they thought the place needed. was in that room that I sat that day looking out to the children below, myself finished a chair that I had hastily nailed together and was now gently resting on before going down to take another batch of wood up to the room, intending to make a table. I got up and was about to start towards the doorway when I heard Thomas calling me from down in the forest below. "John, come to the window. I gotta ask you something." His voice sounded excited, so I turned and settled over to the great port window, opening it. "I have this thing at my house that lets you put holes in things, like a hand drill thingy. I'm gonna get it in a few—" His sentence was cut off as, for some reason, at that moment, I was flying out of the window, plummeting towards the ground. I hit it with a sickening thump. I was in the house. It was dark, and I was lying in a great four-poster bed in the middle of the room. My room. The one on the top floor of the house. As far as I could tell, the house wasn't in the same state of disrepair that I was used to, but nor were there any indication of anyone living in it. The bed was cold, and the sheets smelled musty under and over me. I was lying still, eyes scanning what the little sliver of the room I could see in the dark. I mustered the courage to sit up, eyes fixing on the dark room around me, and there was a wardrobe in the far end of the room, and dust drifted across the gash of moonlight that slipped in through the mangled and moth-eaten curtains. I stared, not understanding what was going on in the slightest. I remembered having been called by Thomas and walking to the window. Then it was all hazy, like there was something I was missing out on, a memory that played and danced across the space between conscious and unconscious thought. The night air whistling through the gap in the curtains was giving the place a menacing feeling, like there was something wrong with the place. I stared into the darkness of the room, trying to make out more of the place. And then the darkness stared back. A pair of black-rimmed purple slashes opened up in the shadows of the room. They were long, sharp, and tapered points at each side. They were angled slightly inwards, giving them the impression that whatever they belonged to was angry or scowling, and they were staring right at me. The eyes were emitting a faint glow, which gave them an even more menacing look. I stared back, frozen in the spot, not even breathing as the eyes began to move from the darkness. A form became visible, broad and lean, made of what looked like writhing darkness, wreathed in purple and black flames. As it approached, the flames died down, leaving only the black outline of the thing, faintly rimmed by the purple light. He saw its hands pointed at the ends, and the flickering black nature of whatever the thing was actually made of. Long tendrils of shadow hung from the back of its head, writhing like snakes in the air, like they were caught in the breeze from behind the creature. As it fully emerged into my line of sight, it stopped, standing tall, humanoid, and projecting an air of absolute malice from its faintly flickering and burning body. And it smiled. A long gash opened in the shape of a smile from one side of its face to the other, the jagged edges forming teeth-like points. The same purple glow issued from within its throat, throwing each point into stark relief. Its smile, coupled with its malevolent gaze, terrified me so much that I finally let out a scream that shook the very bed beneath me. It seemed unfazed, just lifting a single, long, pointed finger and putting it to its lipless mouth, emitting a low, quiet shh. I shushed. Its tall frame began to move again, as it walked the length of the room, stopping at the foot of the bed and sitting gently and silently down on the end of the mattress. Then, with a voice like black satin, it spoke. "No, not now, my dear boy. I have waited ages for you." It reached forward and placed a hand on my forehead, its touch colder than any snow or ice, like the very night had come down to caress my face. And again it smiled, a smile with more malice than I'd ever seen in a human. Just as it removed its hand, I blinked. I was lying in a darkened hospital ward, a bandage wrapped tight around my head. I could only see the faint light coming from the nurse's office 2 wards down, but it was enough to make out the form of my father sitting in the chair beside my bed. He jolted awake when I called him, jumping to his feet, and shouting for a nurse. Turns out I had fallen 2 fairly high stories to what should have been my death. but for what could only be described as miraculous reasons, I'd survived with only a minor skull fracture. Nothing a few weeks on the couch playing Ratchet and Clank couldn't fix. But I could never shake the feeling of the quiet, cold dread I got when I scanned the darkened corners of my room in the dead of night, waiting for the faint purple glow to indicate the presence of that thing. But as of late, it's not the darkness I fear. See, lately I've been seeing things, indications, in my usual nightly cavalcade of debauchery without consequence, as I thoroughly abused my lucid dreams. I've felt eyes on the back of my head, eyes I can't will away. I've seen flashes in dark alleyways as cabs drive through the darkened streets of my own personal city, bringing me to whatever party I had in mind that night. I've seen it standing in the darkness. I've heard it whisper, "My dear boy." So that's my story. I'm starting to get really weirded out by this thing. As if it wasn't enough that it's damn terrifying. It's odd. I can control everything in those dreams, but it is the only thing in the entire dream world that doesn't bend to my influence. I'll have more for you later, when the bed isn't looking so appealing. Yours, my reader, John Black.